And must this valiant hero fall? Cursed be the day thro' ages all Ye streams of proud Monongahela be turned to British tears. His deeds have won immortal fame, nor envy can extinct his name. Old Mars will not allow the same, but pay the long arrears. Braddock's Defeat, July 9th, 1755, by Martha Wadsworth Brewster. The fallout from Braddock's defeat cannot be understated. Accounts of the ill-fated expedition would begin to spring up in newspapers throughout the American colonies at the end of July and early August. At the same time, an account of the defeat by both George Washington, Lord Dunbar, and Governor Dinwiddie would be making its way across the Atlantic to the King and to Parliament. As the American colonies mourned the death of General Edward Braddock, across the pond political pundits and members of Parliament would debate the reason for such a catastrophic defeat. Stunned by the melancholy account of the slaughter on the Monongahela, Lieutenant Governor Spencer Phipps of Massachusetts believed the defeat went beyond what has ever befallen the English arms in the colonies since their first settlement. Many would blame the 2 Irish regiments that were sent along on Braddock's expedition. Some would accuse the Irish of skittish behavior. One British aristocrat thought the Irish were tinged with a mixture of stubbornness and mutiny. Ministers of the Great Awakening, such as Jonathan Edwards, preached from Psalms 6, verse 9 through 12, as he rebuked the vanity of martial pride. Ministers made Braddock a type of King Saul in the Old Testament as they preached from Samuel 2, "How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perish." Those in New England particularly mourned the death of General Braddock, some describing him as a martyr of Britannia. The aristocratic elite in England would blame the colonists. Lady Anson, wife of Admiral Lord Anson, warned her brother, Lord Ralston, "Your own subjects in America must hate, and they and the enemy despise you, and the Indians will all be lost to you." As a member of Parliament, Royston was apprehensive that our American subjects, allies as I was going to call them, will hardly despise the troops of their mother country, which may have in process of time, for aught I know, as bad consequences to ourselves as the French will reap from it now. Braddock's demise had further convinced the politicians in Great Britain that their colonial subjects were due for a future remodeling of their colonial governments. Braddock's death showed that the colonists were uncooperative with the crown. Of course, many would blame Braddock for his foolishness in defeat. Braddock was condemned as violent, obstinate, haughty, impious, profane, overconfident, and rash. In David L. Preston's book, Braddock's Defeat, he wrote, "Outright lies were put forward as truth. Words were already being stuffed into dead men's mouths as soon as the army had retreated safely back to Fort Cumberland. Many of Braddock's most ferocious critics were often the officers who had remained with Dunbar's column and survived the battle unscathed. Braddock was accused of every conceivable mistake, of landing in Virginia when he should have landed in Pennsylvania, of blindly walking into ambuscades or into ambush, of not having any flank protection, of ignoring and driving his Indian allies away, of being governed by a cabal of ambitious staff officers, of burdening the army with a heavy baggage train and more camp followers than would have served an army of 20,000 in Flanders. And while the Brits searched for blame, the French would reap the benefit of Braddock's defeat. Ironically, St. Clair and General Braddock, who put so much time and effort into planning for the expedition, would have Dunbar in his retreat abandoned all of their hard work and supplies to the French. What's more ironic is after the battle on the Monongahela, the French Indian allies went home, and Fort Duquesne was left with a small force of Canadian militia. Preston wrote, "The French and their Indian allies gained three powerful strategic dividends from their victory on July 9th, which ultimately brought New France to the pinnacle of its military dominance of the British colonies. The sheer abundance of battlefield treasure gleaned by native warriors produced a massive surge in native participation in the subsequent French campaigns in 1756 and 1757. The French had captured 21 British cannons and mortars that enabled the future consequences of other British posts. Finally, the French gained considerable diplomatic leverage and military advantage in both Europe and America when they captured Braddock's headquarters papers. Dunbar and his decision to take the army into winter quarters had a catastrophic effect. Not only did he give the French a military and diplomatic advantage in the capture of Braddock's headquarters papers, but his retreat in leaving the frontier in haste left the middle colonies vulnerable, leading governors like Shirley of Massachusetts and Dinwiddie of Virginia to demand Dunbar's recall back to England. Marylander Daniel Dunleavy wrote, "Dunbar left the middle colonies naked and exposed to the fury of the Indians." The Duke of Newcastle wrote that Dunbar ought to be immediately recalled, and he was in November of 1755. Braddock's papers would reveal a plan of duplicity and premeditated aggression by the English. In them were royal instructions from the King and the Duke of Cumberland, along with letters from every leading British minister. It implicated the entire British government in the aggression and belied all the peaceful negotiations between the English and the French in Europe. These papers would be used as propaganda in French newspapers throughout Europe. While the British were crying for peace in 1754, the Duke of Cumberland and the leading ministers of state were busy planning a preemptive war against Canada. French propagandists had much material to cast the British as the aggressors in war. They had the confession of the assassination of Ensign Jumonville by George Washington, premeditated attacks as laid out in Braddock's headquarters papers on Duquesne, Niagara, and Crown Point. The French had more than enough to declare war on the English. They also had Braddock's entire military plan for North America. Before Braddock's ill-fated expedition, he had met with colonial governors in Alexandria, Virginia. He was asking for financial support in his expeditions, but he also made preparations for two additional expeditions against the French in North America. The first would be Braddock's expedition, which was to be led by Braddock to capture Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. According to this plan, Braddock would march northeast after taking Fort Duquesne and meet with a secondary force under the command of Governor Shirley. The second offensive led by Shirley was meant to go and reinforce and repair a garrison at Oswego. After that was done, Shirley was to go and lay siege to both Fort Niagara and Lake Ontario. However, after Braddock's defeat, Shirley abandoned that plan. A third offensive, however, was laid by Sir William Johnson. William Johnson had met with General Braddock on April 14, 1755, privately. Johnson was to be the native liaison between the Iroquois and the English. Though Braddock disliked the Native Americans, he was not naive in the fact that he would need their support at some point. William Johnson was the perfect person for this job. Johnson was an Irish immigrant to the American colonies. Born in 1715 in Ireland, he was the eldest son of Christopher Johnson and Anne Warren. His mother, Anne, was from an old English Catholic gentry family who had lost much of their status to the Protestant English. William Johnson's uncle, Peter Warren, had made a successful career in the British Royal Navy. Warren had settled in the American colonies, purchasing a large tract of undeveloped land along the side of the Mohawk River in New York. Warren had convinced his nephew William Johnson to lead an effort to establish a settlement on that land to be known as Warrensboro, with the understanding that Johnson would inherit much of that land. Johnson had arrived in the New World in 1738 with 12 Irish Protestant families and began to clear much of the land. He would purchase some enslaved Africans to do a lot of the heavy labor and clearing, bringing some of the first African slaves to the New York frontier. Johnson would quickly make a name for himself, trading with Native Americans, particularly the Mohawks and others of the Six Nations of the Iroquois. Johnson would discover trade routes to the north. He bought a house, a small farm on the north side of the river, and built a store and a sawmill in 1739. From this location, which he called Mount Johnson, he was able to cut into Albany's Indian trade. He supplied goods to traders who were headed to Fort Oswego and bought fur from them as they returned downriver. He would deal directly with New York merchants and became closely associated with Mohawk warriors. Johnson became so close with the Mohawk Indians that around 1742 they adopted him as an honorary shaman and chief. He was given the name Warriege, which he translated as a man who undertakes great things. Entered a common law marriage with a Mohawk native named Elizabeth and had several children with her. After Elizabeth died, he would marry a second native Mohawk woman named Mary Brant, the sister of Chief Joseph Brant, a loyalist ally to the British during the American Revolution. During King George's War, though, Johnson would be appointed New York's agent to the Iroquois. He would be known as Colonel of the Warriors of the Six Nations and was instructed to enlist and equip colonists and Indians for a campaign against the French. Working with his friend and Mohawk chief Hendrick Flanagan, Johnson recruited Mohawk warriors to fight for the British. He would organize small raiding parties against the French. Johnson would become England's diplomatic liaison to the Iroquois for the rest of his life. This would make him the perfect Indian agent for General Edward Braddock. Johnson and his Indian allies were tasked in the Third Offensive to capture Fort St. Frederick, located at Crown Point on Lake Champlain, north of Ticonderoga. Johnson had no experience as a military officer, but he was promoted by General Braddock to Major General to lead this expedition. With roughly 3,000 provincials and 300 Mohawk warriors under the leadership of his friend, King Hendrick, Johnson and his officers, including Lieutenant John Stark, Captain Philip Schuyler, and Captain Israel Putnam, gathered in Albany at the end of June. Fortunately, they were delayed waiting for artillery, supplies, and other provisions. On August 8th, he would advance to the Great Carrying Place. This was a swampy area where troops would have to carry their boats and supplies south of the lake, which the French called Lake des Saints-Sacrements and the English renamed to Lake George. After they arrived, they would begin the construction of what would be called Fort Lyman on the east side of the Hudson River. Johnson would eventually rename the fort to Fort Edward after the Duke of York. As Johnson prepared to meet the French in battle, making camp about 14 miles from Fort Lyman, he was unaware that the French already knew his plan. The French commander at Crown Point's Fort St. Frederick was Baron Ludwig August Dieskau. Dieskau was not French, he was German. Born in Dresden, he entered the French army and became aide-de-camp to Marshal Saxe. In 1748, he attained the rank of Major General of the Infantry, and in 1755, he was sent to Canada as commander-in-chief of the French troops in the colony. Baron Dieskau knew that the Brits were headed north. Dieskau prepared his French grenadiers, Canadian militia, and Abenaki warriors, and made plans to attack Johnson's supply line at Fort Lyman, followed by an attack on Johnson's camp at the shores of Lake George. On September 7th, Scouts returned to Johnson's camp and informed him that they had discovered a road that had been cut leading away from South Bay, which was east of Lake George. They were confident that the road had been made by the French and that they were headed to the great carrying place to attack Fort Lyman. If this was true, this would place the French at Johnson's rear, disrupting the supply lines between him and Fort Lyman. Johnson would send a letter to the fort warning that a French attack was imminent. Johnson's plan was to send 500 men to South Bay to take the French boats and another 500 to 800 in the defense of Fort Lyman. King Hendrik, however, did not agree with that plan. Hendrik disagreed with the idea of dividing their forces between two locations. Hendrik even threatened to leave unless Johnson sent everyone to help defend the fort. Johnson agreed and sent 800 militiamen from Massachusetts and New Hampshire, Robert Rogers and his newly formed militia among them, and 200 Mohawk warriors to reinforce Fort Lyman. Fortunately for Johnson, the messenger sent to warn the British at Fort Lyman had been captured by the French. Desgas was now aware that Johnson was sending nearly 1,000 men to reinforce the fort. His scouts also told him that the fort was fortified with cannons and that Johnson's camp was not fortified against any attack. The natives and Canadian militia refused to attack Fort Lyman and insisted on attacking Johnson's camp on the shores of Lake George. On the morning of September 8th, King Hendrik and his Mohawk warriors were at the head of the column of Johnson's reinforcements, who were under the command of Colonel Ephraim Williams. Desgas' French forces were headed north on the same road. Abnaki scouts had informed Desgas that the British were marching south directly towards him. Desgas set up an ambush along a half-mile stretch of road, positioning Canadian militia and Abnaki on both sides of a ravine above the road. He placed his French grenadiers on the road at the south end of the ravine. When the British marched into that part of the road where the French and their allies were waiting, a frightened deer rushed out of the wilderness along the road. King Hendrik was alarmed and said, "I smell Indians." Moments later, some of the French native allies showed themselves and appealed to King Hendrik to withdraw and leave the fighting to the French and the English. After a brief conversation, shots were fired and the fighting began. King Hendrik and Ephraim Williams were killed. Williams was shot down as he jumped on top of a rock in an attempt to rally his men. King Hendrik would be stabbed to death by the bayonet of one of the Abnaki French allied warriors. The British were soon on the retreat, 4 miles back to Johnson's camp, with Desgas chasing them. The rear guard, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Seth Pomeroy, protected the British as they fled, firing from behind trees and rocks, inflicting heavy losses on the French. The leader of the Abnaki was killed during the withdrawal. The engagement became known as the Bloody Morning Scout. As Johnson heard shots from the battle, he ordered his men to fortify their positions. As survivors retreated into Johnson's camp, they took cover behind wagons, trees, and anything they could find. The initial charge on Johnson's camp was led by Abnaki and Canadian militia. They had become disorganized and out of control. Desgas quickly realized that he had lost control over the Canadian and the Indians and charged the camp with his French regulars over and over. Johnson would be wounded early in the assault and turn command over to Colonel Lyman. The fighting would continue throughout the afternoon, but by 5 p.m. the tide had turned in favor of the British. The Canadians and Abnaki were low on ammunition and decided to retreat. The French regulars were completely exhausted and had lost half of their regiment. Desgas would be wounded and captured during the attack, and the French would retreat to the south, away from Lake George. Johnson would then have to fight off his Indian allies to prevent them from killing the captured Desgas. Colonel Joseph Blanchard was in command at Fort Lyman, just south of Johnson's camp. He sent men under the command of Captain Nathan Folsom and William McGinnis as he saw smoke from the battle at Johnson's camp. As they moved toward the camp, they came across the French baggage train, and approximately 300 Canadian and native soldiers. The British ambushed them around 7 p.m. in the evening, and most of the French forces were killed. The bodies of the dead were then thrown into the pond, which became known from this point forward as the Battle of Bloody Pond. The Battle of Bloody Pond was the third and final engagement of the day, and the commencement of a British victory. The Battle of Lake George would be one of the first victories of the Americans over the French and Indians, and would help secure British control over the Hudson Valley. Due to Johnson's victory over the French, he was recognized as an early hero of the war by the British, though he failed to continue to Crown Point and make an attempt to capture Fort St. Frederick. After the battle at Lake George, the French decided to fortify Ticonderoga by building a new fort, which they called Fort Carillon. To better secure the area, Johnson ordered the construction of Fort William Henry near Lake George. A year later, on August 29th, 1756, the 7 Years' War would officially begin when Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded Saxony. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Please make sure that you click that like button and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next episode as we continue down this road to revolution.